Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time we're tackling economic history, but with a twist.
A fascinating twist, I'd say.
Definitely. So we're looking at major economic events, but not just in one country.
Nope, we're going for a two-for-one deal. India, A&D, the U.S.
Exactly. Because seeing how these two economic giants have navigated booms and busts, well,
It gives us a much richer picture of how the global economy really works.
totally. Plus, we'll uncover some surprising parallels and maybe a few, oh no, they didn't, moments along the way.
Oh, there are definitely some oh-no moments.
So buckle up, listeners. Where are we starting off on this global economic adventure?
Let's set our time machine for the late 19th century.
Ooh, the late 1800s. That's a period of huge change, both in India and the U.S.
Right, and we have to talk about India's Great Famine, which lasted from 1876 to 1878.
Right, a devastating famine. But it wasn't just a natural disaster, was it? It seems like there were other factors at play.
Sadly, yes. While drought did occur, its impact was magnified by colonial policies imposed by the British.
Okay, so how did British rule play into this?
Imagine this. India, under British rule, was essentially forced to prioritize exports cash crops like cotton and indigo,
Cash crops, so things that brought in money for Britain, but
but weren't necessarily the food staples that the Indian population relied on.
so while Indian farmers were growing food for export, their own people were going hungry.
It's a tragic illustration of how colonial policies often prioritize the interests of the ruling power over the needs of the local population.
It's heartbreaking, really.
Yeah.
And it speaks to a larger pattern of exploitation, doesn't it? This idea of resource extraction leaving a population vulnerable.
Absolutely. It's a theme that sadly repeats throughout history in various forms.
And it's not hard to see how this set the stage for social and political unrest in India. The famine must have really fueled those calls for independence, right?
It did. The famine became a rallying point for emerging social movements. It exposed the flaws in the system.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the U.S. was dealing with its own economic roller coaster.
Right. Around the same time as India's Great Famine, the U.S. experienced the panics of 1857 and 1873.
And these panics were essentially...
Think of them as sudden economic downturns, marked by bank failures, market crashes.
Okay, and what caused these panics in the U.S.?
Believe it or not, overinvestment in railroads.
Railroads. That's wild. It's like the 19th century version of the dot-com bubble. All the excitement, all the speculation.
Exactly. Everyone wanted a piece of the railroad pie, leading to overbuilding and speculation.
So both countries, India with the famine, the U.S. with the panics-faced economic hardship, but I imagine the responses were quite different.
You're right. One key difference is that the U.S. panics eventually led to greater calls for government regulation, particularly in the financial sector.
Really. So these crises sparked a desire for more government intervention in the U.S.
In a way, yes. These events exposed the need for a more centralized banking system to stabilize the economy and prevent future crises.
That's a stark contrast to India's situation, where colonial control arguably worsened the impact of the famine.
It makes you think about the role of government, doesn't it? For better or for worse, government policies can either mitigate or amplify these economic shocks.
It's a powerful reminder that economics is never just about numbers. It's about people, policies, and the often unpredictable course of history.
And speaking of unpredictable, let's move a few decades forward. The 20th century had even more in store for both India and the U.S., starting with a period marked by global upheaval. The 1930s, to be precise.
The 1930s bringing us to the Great Depression. I imagine this had a huge impact on both the U.S. and India.
Oh, absolutely. We all know the iconic images of Wall Street collapsing, but the Great Depression was a global crisis.
Right. It affected everyone.
And for India, the impact hit hard in the agricultural sector, which was still the backbone of their economy.
Okay, so at this point, India was still heavily reliant on agriculture. What happened when the global demand for their crops just plummeted?
Well, prices crashed, and that created a ripple effect of hardship throughout rural India.
It's a good reminder that economic crises don't just impact stock markets. They have a very real impact on people's everyday lives.
Exactly, especially in countries where agriculture is so central. And for India, this hardship fueled their drive for independence.
Makes sense. So the Great Depression intensified that desire for self-reliance.
Most definitely. It showed the vulnerabilities of their colonial economic structure and fueled the movement for economic independence. Those ideas became central to India's identity after 1947.
It's fascinating how economic events can shape a nation's identity, right? So speaking of 1947, what happened after India gained independence? We hear about their recent economic boom, but what were those early decades like?
That's where things get really interesting. In those early years, India faced a unique set of challenges as a newly independent nation, and they chose to adopt a mixed economy model.
A mixed economy. Could you elaborate on that? I'm not entirely sure what that means.
Sure, imagine an economy trying to balance between private enterprise and government control. That's essentially what a mixed economy is. In India's case, the government took on a big role in key sectors like heavy industries and banking.
So they were kind of navigating this new terrain, figuring out their own path.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about their economic model. Don't forget the Green Revolution that began in the 1960s, a period of intense agricultural modernization.
Right, the Green Revolution, that was a huge deal for India, wasn't it?
Absolutely. They were determined to increase food production, so they introduced high-yielding crop varieties, expanded irrigation, and embraced modern farming techniques.
It sounds like they were tackling challenges on multiple fronts. But that doesn't quite explain how India became the more open, globalized economy we see today. What prompted that change?
You're right. Despite their efforts, India faced a major crisis in 1991, a severe balance of payments crisis.
A balance of payments crisis. What did that mean in simpler terms?
Imagine a country's financial reserves dwindling down to almost nothing, like they're struggling to pay for essential imports. That was India in 1991. It was a wake-up call.
Wow. So that crisis forced them to rethink their entire economic approach.
It did. They realized that to truly thrive globally, they needed to attract foreign investment, boost their exports, and become more integrated with the global market.
And that's what ultimately led to them liberalizing their economy.
Fascinating.
Meanwhile, the U.S. economy was on its own roller coaster ride during the 20th century, right?
Definitely. The U.S. faced its own share of economic ups and downs.
Like what? What were some of the biggest challenges they faced?
Well, for one, they had to navigate the ripple effects of hyperinflation in Weimar Germany. Remember that?
Oh, how could we forget? Wheelbarrows of cash for a loaf of bread. It's like something out of a dystopian novel.
It really highlights the dangers of uncontrolled money printing and economic instability. And then in the 1970s, the U.S. grappled with its own energy crisis when an oil embargo by OPEC hit them hard.
It's amazing how much those historical events resonate with what's happening today. We're still talking about energy security and the impact of global events on oil prices.
You're hitting on a crucial point. History often rhymes, even if it doesn't repeat exactly.
True that. So as we move into the later part of the 20th century, how did the growing interconnectedness of the global economy shape things for both India and the U.S.?
Yeah, the world was becoming more interconnected, for sure. And with that came a whole new level of economic interdependence, for better or for worse.
Oh, absolutely. We
Yeah.
saw some dramatic examples of this in the late 20th century.
Right, like Black Monday in 1987. I remember learning about that. Wasn't that when stock markets around the world just plunged, like all at once?
It was a global stock market crash, essentially.
Yeah.
And it showed just how quickly things could spread in our new globally connected world.
So it all started with a downturn in one market, and then...
It was like a domino effect, rippling outward and hitting markets everywhere.
Yep.
It's kind of scary how quickly things can spiral like that, especially in the financial world. And then, not too long after, you had Japan's lost decade in the 1990s.
That was a tough period for Japan. Their economy stagnated for years, highlighting the dangers of asset bubbles and deflation.
It's a reminder that even economic powerhouses can stumble, you know? Now, I know this was also around the time India was grappling with its own crisis, the 1991 balance of payments crisis we talked about earlier. What happened after that?
Well, they made some big changes. That crisis forced them to rethink their whole approach, leading to liberalization and opening up their economy more.
So they embraced globalization more fully. But even with those reforms, were there still bumps in the road?
Of course. Even with those changes, India was still affected by global events. Take the early 2000s, for example, the dot-com bubble burst and then the 2008 financial crisis. Those had a global impact.
Oh, I remember those days. The uncertainty, the headlines about bailouts, the job losses. That was a rough time for a lot of people. I actually lost my first job out of college when the company went under during the 2008 crisis.
A lot of people have those stories, unfortunately. It was a tumultuous time. The dot-com bubble showed how quickly excitement over new technology could turn into an unsustainable bubble.
And then the 2008 crisis. What a mess. It felt like the whole financial system was on the verge of collapse. So even though India had opened up its economy, did those crises still hit them hard?
They did. It proved that in our globalized world, economic shocks in one place can ripple outward and affect everyone. No country is an island, economically speaking.
It's a bit unsettling when you think about it. But speaking of unsettling, India has made some pretty bold economic moves in recent years, haven't they?
They have, like their demonetization policy in 2016.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Mhm.
Wasn't that when they suddenly pulled high-value currency notes out of circulation?
Mhm.
That seemed pretty drastic. What was
Yeah.
the reasoning there?
They were aiming to crack down on what's called black money funds earned illegally and not being taxed. Plus, they wanted to push for a more digital economy.
Right, a digital economy. Makes sense, but it was controversial, to say the least. People debated whether it was really effective.
It was a bold move, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And it shows how India is willing to experiment to tackle their economic challenges. Of course, we can't talk about recent times without mentioning COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine.
It's been a wild ride these past few years. Those events have really shaken up the global economy, and they're still having an impact.
Absolutely. Supply chain disruptions, inflation, and energy market volatility, these are all challenges that both India and the U.S., and really the entire world, are still navigating.
So as we wrap up this whirlwind tour of economic history, where does India stand today? They've faced famines, colonial rule, embraced globalization, and weathered global crises. What does the future hold for them?
That's the big question, isn't it? India's journey has been remarkable. They've adapted and emerged as a major economic force.
They've come a long way, but as we've seen throughout history, there are always going to be challenges.
Absolutely. The global landscape is constantly shifting. But understanding those patterns we've talked about, the interconnectedness, the role of government, those are key to navigating whatever comes next. It's been fascinating to trace these parallel economic journeys, India and the U.S. uncovering the common threads and unique circumstances that have shaped them into the economic giants they are today. What stands out to you most from our exploration?
Honestly, I'm just struck by how certain themes, the impact of globalization, the role of government, that constant need for adaptation just keep popping up across different time periods and continents.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that economic history isn't just about numbers and graphs. It's ultimately about people and their resilience and their constant pursuit of a better future.